Let's correct some misconceptions about the Japanese katana. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, before I go on, the first misconception that I want to correct is that I dislike or even hate Japanese swords. In my early stages of my YouTube career, of my channel, I did do a lot of videos where I focused on correcting some of the, shall we say, exaggerated, fantabulous views of katanas compared to other swords. And this is a reactionary thing, obviously coming from a HEMA background, primarily European martial arts background, although I have done Asian martial arts as well. I won't go into that in this video, but anyway, but coming from a primarily European point of view, I felt that European swords like long swords didn't get as much credit as they were due. And so Japanese swords, particularly on the internet, and in fact in movies and anime and everything else, get a huge amount of over-exaggerated kind of fetishization, basically, actually, kind of like very, very over-exaggerated sense of really what they are. Now, first thing I have to say is that Japanese swords are fantastically made, not all of them, historically speaking. So obviously this is a modern replica. This, incidentally, that I'll be using in this video is from Swords of Northshire, link below, and I will be doing a full testing and review of this in due course. But for the purposes of this video, it's just an illustrative example. Now, historically, I've actually done a video many years ago now, I think probably about 5 years ago, where I gave a Western viewpoint in historical sources of Japanese swords. And the fact is that Japanese swords were very highly regarded in Europe for their artistry, for their craftsmanship, for their sharpness. Japanese martial arts were very highly regarded. In the 19th century, jiu-jitsu was imported into Britain and elsewhere. The swords themselves had been essentially collector's items in Europe since at least the 17th century. We see them in famous Dutch paintings, for example, and they were a status symbol, not only for the fact that they are well-made, pretty objects and very well-designed and refined objects, but in addition to that, it was representative of the fact that the people who had access to these exotic weapons from abroad they were showing the fact that they were part of the trade networks that spread all over the world, part of the, for example, the Honourable East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, and so on and so forth. So they represented many things. They represented wealth, culture, learning, mercantile activity, financial success, all sorts of things, as well as, being nice swords. Now, I often get asked, were these used in Europe? By and large, no. It doesn't seem that they were really used as weapons. I know of one exception where there is a Southeast Asian sword, in fact it's a Sri Lankan castain, if I remember correctly, being worn by a European officer, but again that could be a status symbol in a similar way to Mamluk sabres, Turkish and Arabic swords being worn later in the Napoleonic period. But back to Japanese swords. So there are many misconceptions even amongst sword people today about these swords, and this isn't going to be an exhaustive video at all. It's just going to be a quick look. So what I think the current, and these change over time, the current main misconceptions about Japanese swords. So one sort of misconception is that they are very short, and I'm partly responsible for this myself. Now, overall, the weapon itself is not particularly short by virtue of the fact that it has a long grip on it, but for a two-handed weapon it is fair to say that it is fairly short. However, if we compare it to a very common and popular type of European sword from the Middle Ages and Renaissance, namely the Langmesser, it's actually really not very different, and you'll notice this particular replica of a Langmesser is slightly shorter than the katana, and they do both have fairly long grips. Now, those of you who know about these swords will be shouting at the screen probably at this point, yeah, but Matt, the Langmesser is primarily a one-handed sword and the katana is primarily a two-handed sword. Well, yes, to an extent. So they were used in two hands a lot, but they were also used in one hand as well. So they're not particularly well suited to being used as one-handed swords, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But just if we're talking about literal length and size, yes, indeed, they're not particularly big for two-handed swords, but really they're not especially short either. Now, I have to admit that this blade is about 28.5 inches. Most historical katanas, certainly from the 19th century, 18th, 19th century, are more like between 26 and 28 inch blades. So they're not very long, they are pretty short. But you've got to remember that's partly relative to the average height of people. And it was known, certainly by the 19th century, and we know this from photographs and all sorts of other records, that the average height in Japan was certainly notably shorter than the average European. So obviously they're proportioned to the size of the people. This is slightly bigger than a typical katana. But there's another elephant in the room, and that is that we always talk about katanas. Now, katanas came around really principally in the 15th, 16th century. Okay, so they kind of developed in the 15th century and became the most common type of sidearm sword, together with a wakizashi, in the 16th century. If we go back to the 12th, 13th, 14th century, then the primary sword was actually the tashi. Now the tashi tends to be, it's not always, but it tends to be longer than the katana, and in fact a lot of katana blades of the 16th century were simply tashi blades that had been reduced in size. So the tang had been shortened, and the shoulders of the tang had been brought up, and sometimes even, especially if there were breakages, sometimes the tip had been moved down, which means you can actually see the hamon, or the hardening line, disappearing out of the end and not going around the end as a newly made sword should have. So in fact, if we go back into the Middle Ages, and we're talking about the period where we're actually comparing with the longsword, the tashi, and obviously this isn't even talking about things like the nodashi and larger forms of Japanese sword, but the typical tashi worn by the samurai was longer than the katana, and for various reasons that I won't go into this video, the gradual reduction in size to katana proportions was probably partly just basically practicality and changes in warfare, was something that resulted in this reduced size sword. So when we're talking about Japanese swords, don't confuse the fact that, don't think that all Japanese swords are really short, because some katanas are not particularly short, and overall in the grand scheme of things, particularly with Asian sword comparisons, they're not particularly short. And if we're talking about earlier Japanese swords, we're really talking about the tashi rather than the katana, and they can actually be fairly long. And of course the nodashi can be very long. Now, another major misconception I see people making about Japanese swords, particularly the katana, is that they are particularly light or nimble swords. And this is not really the case at all. For their size, they are quite blade heavy, almost, I don't want to be insulting, but kind of clumpy feeling swords. Now that does mean that they can strike with a lot of energy and cut with a lot of energy. Because they don't have a lot on the hilt, if I just grab the longsword as a comparison, they don't have much metal on the hilt. So you've got a minimal guard, the tsuba, you don't have a large cross guard, you don't have a metallic pommel, you've got a relatively light hilt. So in terms of weight distribution, yeah, okay, you've got a fairly wide tang in there, but in terms of mass distribution, actually it's all kind of up here in the blade. And also, whilst many katana do have distal taper, they don't tend to have as much distal taper as European swords do. For example, the langmesser, which gets really quite thin, usually towards the tip, or indeed most types of arming sword and longsword, which tend to have distal taper. They don't always, but they usually have distal taper, or they have profile taper. So in other words, the mass reduces as you go up the blade, whereas the katana still retains pretty much the same width and almost the same thickness all the way up. So the weight distribution, mass distribution, is more towards the tip. And if we make a comparison with Chinese swords as well, they are, in terms of the distal taper, more like European swords in most cases. There are some exceptions with some dao, but these more slender type of dao that gave rise really in many ways to the katana and were certainly related in evolution, they tend to have more distal taper than most katana do, although some katana do have more distal taper than others. So they aren't particularly quick or nimble swords. In fact, kind of the contrary. Okay, so for their size, they're not heavy swords, they're relatively light, but they don't feel very light in the hand. So whilst in literal terms this may weigh less than a longsword, It's shorter, it's got less metal in it, it's obvious, it doesn't have as much metal in the hilt. It may weigh less. It doesn't actually feel like it moves more quickly in the hand, and yes, obviously there's different ways of cutting, but there are different ways of cutting in different Japanese ryu. There isn't only one way of cutting, just the same there isn't only one way of cutting with a longsword, but they don't move particularly nimbly compared to European or even Chinese swords. Now, another slight misconception I see going around is about sharpness of Japanese swords. Now, there's a few things at play here. First of all, we have to admit that particularly the katana is kept in a wooden scabbard, okay, and it is worn edge upwards. So these are things which both of those are optimized towards maintaining the edge sharpness. So when you've got your beautiful sharpness on that blade, it's less likely to be damaged or reduced by jangling around in the scabbard. There's certainly no metal scabbard in this era, and they were sharpened with a single bevel. Okay, now a lot of people, I think, when they are exposed to shall we say European swords, they encounter sharp replicas which have a secondary bevel on them. Now, we have to point out that historically, certainly if we go back to the Middle Ages and up to the 16th century, a lot of European swords, be they long swords, mesa, whatever, have single bevels on them. So technically, they are the same type of edge as you actually find on the katana. That is, it's one gradient with no secondary bevel. At most a micro bevel, but not really even that. Okay, so if we look at original surviving medieval European swords, or indeed if we look at a lot of other Asian swords, for example Chinese swords, or indeed quite a lot of Indian swords as well, we find that they do have this single bevel. Now, not all of them do, and you do find secondary bevels. Now, secondary bevels can either be part and product of the design of the sword. So, for example, we often find secondary bevels on Indian tulwar, but they're quite a shallow angle secondary bevel. But sometimes it can be due to resharpening. So, for example, if you have your beautiful single bevel edge, and in the field you have to sharpen and resharpen the sword, or have it resharpened for you, you might not have time to get that beautiful single bevel, and you might end up with an apple seed edge rather than a beautiful straight gradient. So the edges can change through a product of use, and when we see katanas, particularly in good condition, they are in the most perfect state that they would be in. Okay, so they're perfectly sharpened, they're kept immaculately clean. This wouldn't necessarily be the case with katanas that were on campaign and being carried around in the field. They might not be as perfect as that. In fact, they almost certainly wouldn't be. But there is another element. So when we read European accounts, particularly of the 18th and 19th centuries, talking about Japanese swords, in that case katana mostly, sometimes wakizashi, they do comment on the sharpness of these swords. Now, there are several things at play there. It can be literal sharpness, and yes, absolutely, the Japanese were very clearly very interested in making sure their swords were very, very sharp and kept sharp, and so on and so forth, and they were tested on prisoners and all this kind of stuff. So absolutely, they did have a culture of sharpness, where in the 18th and 19th century we know that sometimes in European militaries they had swords that were less than optimally sharp. They used metal scabbards. Sometimes the swords were kept blunt until service, and then they were service sharpened quite quickly, sometimes by people who weren't necessarily professional sharpeners. And the edges weren't necessarily maintained fantastically well. So in an 18th or 19th century comparison, they would look at these swords and go, hell yeah, they're sharp. But equally, we have to point out, they said exactly the same thing of Indian swords and Middle Eastern swords, Turkish swords, and so on and so forth. So, yes, Japanese swords were sharp, but they weren't the only sharp swords around. Some European swords, certainly in the medieval and Renaissance period, were super sharp. Some people who really cared about their sharpening made sure their swords were super sharp in the 19th century, and we know from the sword feats, handkerchief cutting, all this kind of stuff, they could certainly make razor-edged swords in the 19th century when they wanted to. And at the same time, we know that loads of other cultures and places, their sword sharpness was renowned as well. And I have to say, certainly in the British sources, we see the sharpness of Indian swords mentioned the most often. And that is partly to do with exposure, because obviously India was part of the British Empire, Japan wasn't, obviously. But the British sources certainly say, yep, Japanese swords, super sharp. be careful with them, but then they also say the same of Indian swords. So we shouldn't kind of over glorify the sharpness of Japanese swords. We should put it in a big picture context. Yes, they were very sharp and kept very sharp, and the Japanese cared about sharpness, but so did lots of other people at other times. Now, the other misconception I see going around, and again, I might be partly responsible for sort of propagating this idea, is the idea that Japanese swords are bendy, shall we say. Now, this links to the previous point about sharpness. One peculiar thing about Japanese swords, well, I won't say peculiar because you do find it in other places as well. You find it in Nepalese kukri, you find it in certain Chinese swords, you find it in some Indian swords, is the fact that the edge is hardened more than the rest of the blade. Okay, so generally speaking, if you have a traditionally made Japanese sword and you stand on it, not even with a huge amount of force, if you put your foot down on the flat of the blade, it will bend and stay bent. Whereas anyone who watches this channel will know that European swords tend, certainly from the Middle Ages onwards, to have a spring temper. Now, some people have taken this a bit too far, I think, and this is us European sword aficionados responsible for this misconception. And we've taken this too far to say, well, that's superior. It is superior thing that European swords are spring-tempered, whereas Japanese swords and certain other swords from around the world are only edge-hardened and will bend and stay bent. Well, no. Okay, so there are advantages and disadvantages to both, firstly. Okay, clearly a spring-tempered sword is more likely to snap. Okay, a sword which is soft at the back is more likely to bend and stay bent, but then you can just straighten it. Whereas a sword that is spring-tempered, if it breaks, it breaks. Okay, so that's one thing, that's one advantage. The second advantage is you can get greater edge hardness. So if we look at Japanese traditionally made swords, they can be up to 60 plus Rockwell at the edge, whereas European swords, even using modern steels, tend to linger around 50 Rockwell. Now, if we look at historical examples, so if we're looking at historical examples of katana, I have asked an expert, I won't name him because it's not fair without checking to quote him, but I've asked an expert on this who has analysed lots of these swords, and he says that these are often 60 Rockwell or even higher at the edge, whereas original medieval swords are often as low as 30 or 40 Rockwell at the edge. And they vary as well, because the steel that was being used in certainly the good quality Japanese katana, and we have to point out there were also rubbish quality Japanese swords, but not many of them survive, except from the Satsuma Rebellion. But in the good quality Japanese swords, the quality of the steel was excellent, very homogeneous and very good edge hardness. So there are advantages to the ways of making Japanese swords. Edge hardness, which can also relate to edge sharpness, and also durability, the fact that they're less likely to snap. But there is another elephant in the room. So you remember what I said about the distal taper and the fact that these are quite blade heavy? Well, that actually equates to an advantage in this point of view, because these types of swords don't really need a spring temper. Because they're fairly thick blades for their size and fairly weighty, they're actually less likely to bend. If you made a Langmesser, which is really thin and light, and if you didn't have a spring temper in this, then this would bend really, really quite easily. However, a katana does not bend really easily, because it's quite a thick blade. And you'll notice that actually a katana is actually not a very wide blade, it's a pretty narrow blade. It's as narrow as most 19th century European sabres, but it is thicker than most European cavalry or infantry sabres, military sabres. So it's a very strong blade, it's a very durable blade, and in this case it's got a very hard edge and it's got a very sharp blade. So it's got lots of advantages to it in that regard. Now, another misconception about Japanese swords is around the tips. And I see a lot of people who are fans of European swords extolling the virtues of the very slim and pointy tips on European swords. Now, whilst it is true that the European sword tip will penetrate through certain things more effectively, for example through mail armour, and the point of a sword, certainly held in half sword, can go through mail, and for getting in gaps, obviously in later period plate armour as well. But just in terms of depth of penetration, if you're stabbing this into meat, for example, you will get deeper penetration, which, as you all know, I'm a massive fan of, you will get deeper penetration with a more slender tip. It's a simple matter of friction. Okay, it's the same thing as using a long, narrow bodkin point to get deep penetration into soft material, as opposed to using a so-called plate cutter type of armour penetrating tip, which might be great for going through certain types of armour, but is not so good for deep penetration because of greater friction. Now this tip, whilst indeed it might not get such deep penetration, it is still a very, very good tip. Now, I often talk about symmetrical and asymmetrical tips, and this is an asymmetrical tip, which in theory has some disadvantages to it. But the advantage is that the tip is located at the back of the spine. Now, the spine is where the thickness of this blade is. So the Japanese blade is thin at the edge and is thick at the back. So by putting the tip at the back, it actually gives you really quite a strong, almost reinforced tip. And in fact, if we look at naginata, for example, you do in fact find reinforced tips on naginata blades, and some naginata type blades were brought through into other Japanese blades. In fact, they were sometimes mounted up as tanto, but we do see that influence sometimes on these sort of armour penetrating tips. So don't think that the Japanese sword is bad at thrusting. You can absolutely thrust into the types of materials that they are designed to thrust into within a Japanese armoured or unarmoured fighting context, and this is a very, very strong tip. And we could say to some degree that the Japanese sword tip, and this is a perhaps contentious point, but the Japanese sword point is perhaps more durable than the more slender types of European tip. Obviously, if you're thrusting into meat, that's not necessarily particularly important because both of them will do the job perfectly well. But if you're thrusting into certain types of armour, then potentially this broader reinforced type tip could be stronger. Now I have to caveat that point with the fact that this type of blade is very, very hard and will be possibly more brittle at the tip than the spring-tempered type of tip with lower hardness but greater toughness at the tip in the European blades. So, you know, there's some pluses and minuses there, but don't think that Japanese sword tips are bad at thrusting. They just have different qualities and different strengths and in some cases weaknesses to them. Now the other misconception I see, again, which might have been propagated partly by my channel and other similar ones, is about hand protection. And a lot of people who are, you know, whatever, we won't call them weebos, but basically longsword fanboys and fangirls, kind of bang on about the fact that, oh, your katana doesn't have much hand protection. I'd prefer something with more hand protection on it. Let's be honest, guys. Medieval European swords don't have a lot of hand protection. I do sabre and basket hilt and stuff like this. Those things have got lots of hand protection. Medieval swords don't really have a lot. And yeah, you get additional things. You get finger rings and side rings and the nagel and stuff like this on slightly later medieval swords. So you do get more and more hand protection, but they don't have a huge amount. They have nothing at the front for the most part. You do get knuckle bows on some, but that's a fairly rare feature. Most cross-hilted medieval swords don't have much hand protection. And equally, if you go back earlier into medieval history and you look at Viking era swords, yeah, okay, they're designed to be used with shields, but nevertheless they don't have much hand protection. If you go to obviously the Roman era swords, Gladius and Sparta, they don't have much hand protection. But if we stay in the era of the katana and the tashi and go to China, it's not like Chinese swords have much more hand protection. In fact, possibly even less on this type. Obviously, once you start to get circular disc guards in Asia, you find them in China, in Korea, in Mongolia. You start to see these very similar types of guards actually all over Asia, certainly the sort of northern parts of Asia. If we go to South Asia and we go to India and Sri Lanka, places like this, you don't see an awful lot of hand protection on a lot of swords there. You do get types of basket hilt in the 16th century in India, which may or may not be influenced or cross-pollinated with European swords, we don't know. But yeah, you do get on certain types, Kanda for example, and Farangi, you do get good hand protection on some of them, But on most tulwar, and if we go to most African swords and Middle Eastern swords, you don't get an awful lot of protection, at most a crossguard. So, you know, we've got to be realistic here. None of these swords really, none of these battlefield swords, whether they're being used by people wearing hand protection, forms of gauntlet or not, most of them don't have very much in the way of hand protection. And we've also got to recognise that there was clearly in the Middle Ages in Europe a growing, and possibly related to the fact that we were using spring steel blades, there was a growing tendency for blade on blade contact in fencing systems. And it does seem that whilst there was a lot of blade on blade stuff also in China and elsewhere, the fact is that it seems to have been slightly less accentuated. And if you do less of the blade on blade binding and winding and sliding, this kind of thing, then there's less of a need for much hand protection. And really also we have to mention that when you get into rapiers and side swords and things like this, you're getting into much more thrust-centric sword play, and in that you do need more hand protection, and also that's a different type, it's a different kind of context. There's a lot more, you know, dueling context comes into it as well. And if that's the case, certainly if you're doing more thrust-centric stuff, you need more hand protection. But if you're doing more cutting stuff with larger motions, like with longsword or indeed with katana, then you don't need so much hand protection. You just fence in a different way. That means your hands aren't stuck out in front of you as much. It's a different form of footwork. It's a different way of moving the sword, different forms of defense, and so on. So, yes, katanas don't have an awful lot of hand protection, but that's true of loads of other swords as well. So the final misconception that I'm going to deal with in this video is the idea that the Japanese sword, be it the earlier tachi and later the katana, and the uchi katana that comes kind of between those, that it was a purely insular development. And this just isn't the case, okay? So there are two things. First of all, yes, Japan did have a fair amount of isolationism compared to lots of other places for certain parts of its history, but it is absolutely clear to me, having now learned a lot more about Chinese swords in 2020, that Chinese swords made an absolutely fundamental and critical part on the development of early Japanese swords. To me, there is just no question whatsoever that essentially early Japanese swords were Chinese swords. And there was a continual contact and exchange in both directions between Japan and China. And in fact, some of the examples of early Chinese swords that we have as examples to model things like this replica on are actually survive in Japanese temples, but they're Chinese swords, and in many cases they've been refitted with later Japanese fittings, and it's sometimes difficult to discern, okay, what's Japanese and what's Chinese, which is developed, you know, how are these mixed up together, what parts belong to which, and also which period as well. But the fact is that a lot of what we know about early Chinese swords are actually from Japanese temples, and we know that the earliest Japanese swords really were Chinese swords. Now, that's not to say that some development didn't happen within Japan sort of by itself. I think that's absolutely the case. And there are certain features of Japanese swords which are utterly, utterly Japanese and not, you know, taken from China or taken from Korea or whatever. They are just Japanese features that developed in an insular fashion. But that being said, they didn't necessarily stay in Japan. So the fact is that people talk about Japanese katanas mostly, but Japanese swords they should really say, because it relates to the tachi for a lot of the period as well, as if they were developed in Japan pretty much mostly from Japanese development and then kind of stayed there. But the fact is that Japanese swords hugely, largely through war and piracy and things like this, but also through trade, and diplomacy and diplomatic gifts and all this kind of stuff. Japanese swords did influence sword design in other places, principally and most famously in China and also in Korea. And it's very, very clear that Chinese swords, whilst they probably gave 90% of the original designs of the earliest Japanese swords then did come back and influence later Chinese swords. And equally, we know this absolutely happened, certainly from Japan to Korea as well. And Korean swords were completely, definitely influenced by Japanese swords and by Japanese martial arts. And of course, this, I should mention martial arts in passing as well. There was a two-way exchange as well, and you know, famously, anyone who knows anything about karate knows that karate is essentially a Japanese form of kung fu, as far as we know. So it's a sort of Japanesized version of forms of kung fu. So the fact is that there was a martial exchange as well as a material exchange, and the fact is that Japanese swords were both a product of influence from outside Japan, but then themselves did influence other swords outside of Japan. Anyway, I hope this video has been somewhat useful and also perhaps useful in redressing some of the misconceptions that I've played a part in spreading about Japanese swords. Just again to repeat, I do love Japanese weapons. I think anybody who likes swords and weapons and martial arts can't really dislike Japanese swords because they are beautiful things. They're also very different things. If you're used to Chinese swords, certainly later period Chinese swords, if you're used to European swords, a katana is just a very different thing. A lot of people, I think, compare European longsword with Japanese katana because, yeah, there's some comparisons to be made. They're both related to a kind of knightly class or samurai class. They're both used in armour and out of armour. They were both used in dueling, sort of knightly dueling. They're both two-handed, they're both held in similar guard positions. So there's lots of comparisons to be made, but they are really, really quite different swords. And whilst fundamentally, yeah, they both cut and thrust and they're both two-handed and they're both about that big, fundamentally, they are quite different. They handle very differently. They feel very, with your eyes shut, they feel completely different in the hand. They've got very different ergonomics in terms of how the hilt feels in your hand. They've got very different guards, which leads you to doing certain things in fencing with them that is different. They've got very different kinds of styles of tip, and they're made in very, very different ways as well. So there are a lot of differences, and they are, for that reason, for me anyway, very interesting swords because I handle European swords all the time. So when I handle Japanese or Chinese swords, it's like refreshing. It's like going on holiday for me. So they're beautiful things. And as I've always said, if you do backyard cutting or even lots and lots of cutting, I think if you don't have a katana, you're really missing out because they are wonderful to cut with. It's what they're designed for. They're really specialized for that. And what you feel they may lack in some areas, they really make up for in others. So anyway, link below to Swords of Northshire. I will be doing soon some testing and reviewing of this sword, which was a custom build that I had them put together for me. So thank you to them for that. It's a very pretty sword. It's very nice. I'm very happy with it. The fit and finish is lovely, but we'll talk more about that in the review video. Thanks for watching. Give us a like and a subscribe if you haven't done already, and I'll see you very soon again on the channel for another video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.